All right, so get ready because we're diving deep into true crime today, and I know you're interested in this one. Charles Albanese, a seemingly ordinary man, well, he turned out to be anything but. We're going to take all those sources that you've gathered, all the articles, the research, your own notes, and really dissect what makes this case so fascinating and disturbing.
What's really intriguing about Albanese is this, this jarring contrast between outward appearance and inner darkness. He lived what many would consider a successful life, good job, nice house, family vacations. But underneath it all, there was this simmering ambition, a desire for wealth that would eventually lead him down a very dark path.
Yeah, you've really hit the nail on the head with that contrast.
Yeah.
He was born in 1937 in Chicago, and even in his early years, there were these hints of this desire for easy money, almost like he was always looking for a shortcut to success.
And that desire manifested early on. In 1965, he impersonated a detective and committed armed robbery. Now, this incident might seem like a small blip on his timeline, but looking back, it foreshadows a key aspect of his character, a willingness to deceive and manipulate to get what he wants.
Like a glimpse into the criminal mastermind he would later become. And this pattern of deception continued as he got older. Failed marriages, dodging child support payments, all while maintaining this carefully constructed facade of stability. It makes you wonder, did anyone around him suspect the darkness lurking beneath the surface?
It's a question that often arises in these cases. Were there subtle signs that people overlooked or dismissed? Or was he truly a master manipulator, able to completely compartmentalize his criminal life from his public persona?
That's a fascinating point. It's like he was leading two completely separate lives. And for a while, he managed to keep those worlds from colliding. He had this seemingly successful career as president of his father's company, a nice home in Spring Grove, Illinois, even indulging in vacations. It's almost like he was trying to prove to the world, and maybe even to himself, that he was living the American dream.
And that carefully crafted image makes the events of 1980 all the more shocking. This is where things take a sinister turn, and we see Albanese's true nature begin to emerge.
Yeah, this is where his focus shifts to his wife's family, specifically her mother and grandmother who are living in a retirement community. And it's unsettling how he went about gaining their trust. You pointed out in your notes that Albanese started visiting them more frequently, bringing gifts, sharing meals, acting like the doting son-in-law.
And that's a classic tactic used by manipulators. They create this sense of obligation and indebtedness, making the victims more susceptible to their schemes. In Albanese's case, it was all part of a calculated plan to isolate and ultimately eliminate those who stood between him and a sizable inheritance.
And this is where the arsenic comes into play. He meticulously researched this deadly poison, contacting a metal plating company under the guise of seeking advice on pest removal. Just imagine him sitting at his desk, researching this deadly substance, all the while maintaining his everyday routine. It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It really highlights the chilling duality of his character. He was able to compartmentalize these horrific acts, separating them from his outward persona, and the fact that he chose arsenic, a poison that can mimic natural illness, speaks to his desire to make the deaths appear like natural causes. He was planning the perfect murders, attempting to erase any trace of his involvement.
And for a while, it seemed like he might get away with it. In August of 1980, his wife's mother suddenly dies, seemingly from a heart attack. Just 12 days later, the grandmother succumbs to similar symptoms. Can you imagine the fear and uncertainty in that community? People were probably questioning everything, the food, the water, wondering if some unknown illness was spreading.
Of course. These sudden unexplained deaths would naturally spark a wave of panic and speculation. And all the while, Albanese is playing the role of the grieving family member, further cementing his image as an innocent bystander. But behind that mask of concern, he was already reaping the benefits of his sinister plan. His wife received a significant inheritance, marking the first success in his twisted scheme.
And it's this pattern of death followed by financial gain that becomes even more apparent when we look at what happened next. Albanese had a falling out with his own father, leading to a demotion at the family business. Now, you might think this would be a wake-up call, a moment for reflection, but instead it seems to have fueled his ambition, his desire for control, and ultimately his murderous intentions. We'll delve into this next chapter, but before we do, let me ask you this. Knowing what we know now, do you think anyone could have predicted Albanese's descent into such darkness?
It's a tough question. I mean, on the surface, he seemed like, a regular guy. But I guess the signs were there all along. That desire for easy money, The willingness to deceive. It's like a seed of darkness that was just waiting to sprout.
That's a really interesting way to put it, a seed of darkness. And we'll see how that seed grew and spread as we continue our deep dive into the case of Charles Albanese right after this.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? To think that someone could be so meticulously planning the demise of their own family members, driven by greed and this insatiable desire for control. And in Albanese's case, this darkness seems to have intensified after that falling out with his father.
It's like something snapped inside him.
Yeah.
He starts bringing homemade treats to work for his father and brother. Seemingly innocent gestures, right?
Mm-hmm.
But knowing what we know now, it's impossible not to see them as sinister acts. A calculated way to administer the poison under the guise of familial affection.
And the results were tragically predictable. Both his father and brother fall ill with those same mysterious symptoms. That plagued his wife's family. While his brother luckily survives, his father succumbs to the poison. And once again, Albanese benefits financially from the death.
You mentioned in your notes that the inheritance he received from his father was quite substantial. It really solidifies this disturbing pattern. Death followed by financial gain. It paints a very clear picture of his motive, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And this pattern is a key element that investigators would later seize upon. But for a while, Albanese continued to evade suspicion. Remember, this was the early 1980s, before forensic science was as advanced as it is today. Poisoning, especially with a substance like arsenic, was often difficult to detect.
It makes you wonder how many cases like this might have gone unsolved in the past. Simply because the technology wasn't there to uncover the truth. It's a sobering thought.
Indeed. But in Albanese's case, there was a crucial turning point. During the autopsy of his father, the coroner noticed something peculiar. There were traces of arsenic in his system, a detail that had been overlooked in the previous deaths.
That's incredible. It's amazing how one seemingly small detail can unravel an entire web of deception. It's like a tiny crack in a dam that eventually leads to a catastrophic collapse. What happened next?
The discovery of arsenic in Albanese's father's system was a game changer. The authorities exhumed the bodies of his other alleged victims, and the results were conclusive. Each one had been poisoned with arsenic. The investigation intensified, and all eyes turned to Charles Albanese.
I can only imagine the pressure mounting on him as the net closed in. Did he try to flee? Did he maintain his innocence? What was his reaction when they finally came for him?
Well, according to a newspaper clipping you provided, Albanese was surprisingly calm when authorities apprehended him at his office. He had been planning a trip to Jamaica with his wife and mother, and some believe he was about to make his mother his next victim.
That's terrifying to think about. It's like his greed and his willingness to kill had spiraled completely out of control. He was no longer just reacting to circumstances. He was actively seeking out new victims, driven by this insatiable need for wealth and power. But with his arrest, his carefully constructed world came crashing down, and he was finally forced to face the consequences of his actions.
The arrest marked the beginning of a lengthy legal battle, one that would captivate the nation and expose the true depths of Albanese's depravity. He faced two separate trials, one in Lake County for the deaths of his father and mother-in-law, and another in McHenry County for the murder of his wife's grandmother.
It must have been a media frenzy. A seemingly respectable businessman, accused of systematically poisoning his own family members. It's the kind of story that grabs headlines and sparks public outrage. What was the atmosphere like during those trials?
The trials were highly publicized, and public interest was intense. People were fascinated and horrified by the case, eager to understand how someone could commit such heinous acts against those closest to them. And Albanese's demeanor throughout the proceedings only added to the intrigue.
What do you mean? How did he act in court? Did he show any remorse? Did he try to defend his actions?
From the accounts you shared, Albanese remained remarkably composed throughout the trials. He didn't deny the charges outright, but he attempted to deflect blame, claiming others were responsible, even suggesting a conspiracy against him. But his attempts to manipulate the narrative ultimately failed. The evidence against him was overwhelming.
It's almost as if he couldn't grasp the severity of his crimes. Or perhaps he was so consumed by his own self-preservation that he was incapable of genuine remorse. It's a chilling thought. But what about the prosecution? What was their strategy in building the case against him?
The prosecution meticulously presented a mountain of evidence, including the arsenic purchases, witness testimonies about Albanese's behavior before and after the deaths, and of course the undeniable pattern of death followed by financial gain. They argue that his actions were not impulsive or driven by passion, but rather cold, calculated, and motivated purely by greed.
And the jury ultimately agreed with that assessment, right? They found him guilty on all charges. She must have been a tense moment in the courtroom, waiting for those verdicts to be read.
The tension was palpable. And when the guilty verdicts were announced, there was a sense of relief, a collective exhale from the community. Justice had been served, but the story was far from over. The question of punishment remained. And given the gravity of his crimes, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty.
That's a heavy question, and one that deserves careful consideration. The death penalty is a complex issue with no easy answers. But in Albanese's case, it was a question that the jury had to grapple with. And their decision would have far-reaching consequences, not only for Albanese, but for the families of his victims and for society as a whole. Yeah, it's hard to imagine what must have been going through the minds of those jurors as they deliberated on such a weighty decision to hold someone's life in their hands, to decide whether or not to impose the ultimate punishment. It's a responsibility that few of us will ever face.
And in Albanese's case, there were compelling arguments on both sides. The defense, of course, argued for life in prison, emphasizing his lack of prior violent offenses and the possibility of rehabilitation. But the prosecution painted a starkly different picture, portraying him as a cold, calculating killer who posed a continued threat to society.
You highlighted a passage in one of the articles about the prosecutor's closing arguments. It seems they really focused on the premeditated nature of the crimes, the meticulous planning, and the callous disregard for human life. They argue that these factors, combined with the sheer number of victims, warranted the death penalty.
Yes, and the jury ultimately agreed. They found Albanese's crimes to be so heinous, so devoid of remorse, that they deemed the death penalty to be the only appropriate punishment.
It must have been a surreal moment for Albanese when he heard that verdict, to know that his own life was about to be taken as a consequence of his actions. Did he react at all? Did he show any emotion? According to the court transcripts you provided, Albanese remained stoic when the sentence was read. He didn't lash out, didn't plead for mercy. It was as if he had already accepted his fate. It's almost as if that facade he had so carefully constructed, that image of the successful businessman, had finally crumbled completely, leaving behind a cold, emotionless shell of a man. But even in the face of his impending execution, there was one detail that I found particularly jarring. You noted that Albanese requested a surprisingly normal last meal. Prime rib, baked potato garlic bread, even pistachio ice cream. It seems so incongruous with the horrific nature of his crimes.
It is a strange juxtaposition, isn't it? Some might interpret it as a final act of defiance, a refusal to acknowledge the gravity of his situation, but I wonder if it wasn't something else entirely.
What do you mean?
Well, perhaps it was a desperate attempt to cling to some semblance of normalcy, to reconnect with a life that was slipping away from him, maybe in that moment facing the ultimate punishment. He just wanted something familiar, something comforting.
That's a thought-provoking perspective. It humanizes him in a way that's almost unsettling, especially considering the callous disregard he showed for the lives of his victims.
It's a reminder that even the most hardened criminals are still human beings, capable of complex emotions and contradictions. But regardless of his motives, that last meal serves as a stark reminder of the duality of his character. The ordinary man who enjoyed simple pleasures, and the ruthless killer who meticulously planned the deaths of those closest to him.
And ultimately, those two sides of Charles Albanese collided on September 20th, 1995, when he was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center. He reportedly made no final statement, simply thanking the warden before the drugs took effect.
His execution marked the end of a long and disturbing chapter in American criminal history, a case that shocked the nation and raised profound questions about the nature of evil, the power of greed, and the fragility of trust.
It's a case that continues to fascinate and horrify even decades later. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that darkness can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives, that even those we trust the most can be capable of unspeakable acts.
And it serves as a stark reminder that we must always be vigilant, to question assumptions, and to never take for granted the sanctity of human life.
This deep dive has certainly been a journey, filled with twists and turns, chilling details, and ultimately a sense of profound sadness.
But as we conclude this exploration, I encourage you to continue pondering the questions this case raises. What could have been done to prevent these tragedies? What warning signs might we miss in our own lives? And how can we foster a society where such acts of greed and violence are less likely to occur?
These are questions that deserve our attention, not only as true crime enthusiasts, but as members of a society that must constantly strive to understand and address the root causes of such darkness. So as you delve further into this case, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who wear the masks of normalcy, And it's up to us to learn from these stories, to be vigilant, and to protect ourselves and our loved ones from those who might seek to harm us. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.